so I could be culturally sensitive. They actually said, hey, when we go out to these meetings, this is the right type of shirt to wear. Doesn't it look good? I actually got Heather on the phone and I said, which color? Because I'm not colorblind, but maybe I am. But this is the culture, what I need to wear when I go to these meetings. I had to learn that. My counterpart, Melissa, when we had meetings with Muslim leaders, this is the shawl. She went and they said, let us help you find the right culturally appropriate garb. Culture, we swim in it. Like a fish that's in water, we don't know it's there until we're taken out. And we don't notice culture even while it's all around us. But God meets people where they're at, using their cultural symbols, what people understood to be norms, and how to deal with authority and everything. He uses those things where they're at. But here's the thing. As the passage we're about to study, which took place 4,000 years before us, that culture is also changed by God. He uses it. He uses the same symbols, but he also changes it into the way that he wants us to understand how he wants us to live. This passage we're about to see deals with how to deal with cultural norms when you're dealing with people in authority. Remember, I showed you the outfit that I had to wear, and my outfit was easier to choose, but I needed help with discovering what's the right things to wear. You don't show up to meetings in shorts. You have to have dress pants and a nice shirt. But the passage we're about to read, we will see what seems to be an incredibly strange story to us. A story of Abraham where he met with God in a way that would be normative back then to how you would meet with a king and a vassal. Remember, this story was also written 400 years after it happened. Moses wrote this story. He got it from the writings of Joseph, who was the prime minister of Egypt. The audience, though, understood the formula for the meeting that was about to happen. And at the end, God throws in this huge twist. So let's read this passage together. Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 to 21. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Ebenezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is the own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he is credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said, Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought them to these to him. Cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite of each other. The birds, however, did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterwards you will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried in a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Ammonites will not be reached to its full measure. Then the sun set, the darkness had fallen, and a smoking pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give you the land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great rivers of the Euphrates, the land of the Canaanites, and the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rebites, Ammonites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Now, that is a weird passage. If you have no context, you're like, what on earth did we just read? Now remember, this was written by Moses 400 years after it happened. And those original readers understood the formula that was going on. They understood that this was a narrative of how you make a covenant between a king and a vassal. So the vassal would come to the king, and the king would say, here's curses that are going to happen to your family if they don't listen. Here's things that are bad that are going to happen. Be prepared. But on the other hand, I'm going to give you these blessings. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you descendants. I'm going to give you what you need, but you need to obey me. And if you and your descendants don't obey me, death comes into the picture. Everybody that heard this being read on the Mount Sinai the first time, because that's when Genesis was given to people. It was on Mount Sinai. So everybody understood this is the formula. And cutting those animals in half, 3 years old, they were the animals of the greatest value. So you have a heifer, a ram, and a sheep. And 3 years old, they're at the strength. This is costly. So the understanding is Abram, and remember, this is still Abram. He hasn't been renamed Abraham yet. Abram is giving up the best of his flock, saying, this is costing me something. I understand that. Everybody understood that at some point the king would show up and Abram would walk between the animals. This was a symbol of saying, you're walking through the valley of death. If you don't follow, you're the one that will be cut in half. You will die. Everybody understood this. So Abram is waiting for God to show up so he can show to everyone, look, I'm going to show to God, I'm willing to walk through and say that I will be obedient and my descendants will be obedient. But what happens? That's where the twist comes in. That's where when the original readers first heard this, they're like, what? God shows up in this dreadful darkness, and a smoking pot shows up, which symbolizes the Holy Spirit, and stops Abram from walking through the valley of death himself, and it goes through. He goes through. The King of the universe, the one who made the promises, walks through the valley of death. The reason I'm sharing this message is my daughter, Hannah, came home from Bible school about 5 years ago and said, why don't we hear about this incredibly important story? Right from day one, we see that it's God that takes on the penalty of death and sin. Right from day one, right from the very moment that Abram makes his promise and his covenant with God, Abram does nothing to earn his own salvation. And even when he's supposed to say, look, it's me that's going to be obedient, God says, and I'll take the punishment when you're not obedient. Because if you look at the very next story, the very next chapter, what does Abram do? He doesn't believe God. He doesn't believe that he's going to have a descendant. He takes things into his own hands, and he has an affair planned with his wife Sarah, with Hagar, and they have Ishmael. Like immediately, he doesn't listen. God knew that Abram would be unable to listen. And right from the very beginning, we see that God is saying, I'm taking on all the consequences of sin in a cultural understanding that everybody who read it understood. Let me jump ahead to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 to 16. You can go to that slide. Next one. Okay. By faith, let's go to the Hebrews part. I know what I forgot to do. I forgot to tell you to go to the scripture passages. Okay, keep going. Hebrews 11, verses 8 to 16. By faith, Abraham, who was called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were his heirs with the same of him in the same promise. For he looked forward to the city with functions, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promises. And so from this one man, who is as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All of those people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were the foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show how they're looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called God, their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Like I said, culture is like the water fish swim in. God always meets people where they're at, using their cultural symbols. What people around them understood to be their norms of how to deal with authority and ultimately deities. But God was in the act of transforming culture. God does not leave culture where it's at. He's in the act of transforming people, and when he transforms people, he's in the act of transforming the chosen people that he's chosen to call to follow him. In the passage we just studied, there's 4,000 years of history between us and Abram. A lot has changed in how we deal with power and authorities in just the past 100 years. But God's formula for using culture, meeting people where they're at, and then changing the culture to show how his character is still being done today. In ancient Egypt, ancient Middle East, in a time of a covenant which lasts generations, it's the servant who walks through the valley of death. But in this case, it's the king who walks through the valley of death. Abram thinks he's going to give his offering of obedience. But instead, God walks through himself and says, I will take on the penalty of death. Because he knew Abram and his descendants would mess up. Abram immediately messed up, as I said, with Ishmael. Moses, the one who wrote this, he murdered an Egyptian. He struck the rock of God against his commands. King David, the one after God's own heart, has an affair with Bathsheba. Manasseh, the descendant of David, sacrifices the infant crown prince to the Phoenician god of war. Peter denied Christ 3 times. Paul murdered Christians. And what do all of those have in common? They were descendants of Abram, and they all repented, and they accepted God's sacrifice of walking through the valley of the shadow of death. If you look at the chapter just before we read this passage in Genesis, God shows up in another unusual way with a high priest called Melchizedek just outside of Jerusalem. And they make a covenant of saying, I will follow you, God. And then immediately after this, there's this walking through the valley of shadow of death. Where did this occur? Just outside of Jerusalem. So in the temple, at the Holy of Holies, where Abram and Melchizedek make a covenant between him and God and the sacrifice, the temple of God would be built by King David's son, Solomon, a few hundred years later, at the place where the valley of the shadow of death, it's known as the place of the skull. Do you know where that is at? That's Calvary. The place where Christ would die is the very place where God walked between the animals saying, I'll take on that death. What we see by this is we see that God takes it all. That is a transforming idea. Us religious folk, we often add checklists to things to say that we've maybe earned our way to heaven. That's the trap of religion. But God took it all. I love how Matthew chapter 11 says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and lean on me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Religiosity adds buckets to the yoke. When Jesus says, "I'll take my yoke," doesn't mean he's not saying you have a burden in life, but I'm going to give you the technology to carry it better, because that is what a yoke was. My question is, are we trying to add to earning our salvation? Let it go free. It was paid for on the cross. If you can close with that last song that you had.
I invite you to stand.